of the SNP. But before that, civil servants have been trying to prevent deportation flights taking off for Rwanda. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News. I'm joined in the studio now by Olivia Utley to discuss this. Now, back in the good old days, it used to be a case the civil service was meant to be politically neutral. In this instance, it appears that they're not. What's the detail?
Well, what's happened is that the government introduced the Rwanda bill last week, and under a clause in that Rwanda bill, ministers can ignore injunctions from judges from the European Court of Human Rights and send migrants to Rwanda. Basically, this bill overrules these international laws. Now, ministers obviously instruct civil servants to carry out their policies, but civil servants, or at least the FDA, the union which represents senior civil servants, is worried that once this bill is implemented, civil servants will be in an awkward position. Under the Civil Service Code, they are obliged to obey the will of ministers, to implement policies that have been passed in Parliament, but they are also obliged to follow international law. Now, if the will of ministers is, which is, the will of the people, because ministers are elected politicians, comes up against the will of judges in Strasbourg, then civil servants worry that they will be in danger of breaking the Civil Service Code if they follow ministers' instructions. Now, the government has said categorically that civil servants would not be in danger of breaking the Civil Service Code. The government argues that the civil service is there to implement policies passed through Parliament by ministers. So the civil servants' one and only job is to get those policies up and running. But the FDA disagrees, and they are now taking the issue to the High Court. It'd be really interesting to see what the High Court makes of all of this.
And the fact that it's a union involved here would suggest that there is a level of politicisation of the decision. Unions don't tend to be conservative in their political output. And it begs the next question. Is it time? Donald Trump has said that he will do this in America if he is re-elected. He'll go nuclear on this situation. He said in America that federal employees, similar situation to civil servants here, were dead against a lot of his more radical plans on border control, on the economy. He's going to make them all reapply for their own jobs. And if they're not in line, falling in line with the direction of travel of the ruling constitution, the Republican Party, the president, he's going to kick them out. So is there any prospect that that could happen in Britain? It's like, if you want to be a civil servant, you need to actually do your job and do as the government wants, rather than trying to derail it all the time.
I don't think there's an appetite in Britain yet for civil servants who have to sign up wholesale to government ideas, but there is definitely some disquiet in government and on the Conservative benches with the idea that there are some civil servants and some very senior civil servants, perhaps particularly in the Home Office, who are actively now trying to frustrate the will of ministers and, by implication, the will of the people. It'll be really interesting to see if Labour has the same problem when it gets into government. It's very difficult to find anyone at the moment who believes that the Home Office is doing a good job. Is that because the Home Office has just become too big, too unruly, as lots of people argue, and is essentially impossible to function smoothly? Or is it because there are senior civil servants who are deliberately rowing against the will of Parliament, the will of the government? We will find out if and when Labour gets into power, because then there will either be the same sort of friction that we're seeing at the moment, or, magically, Labour policies will just sail through to implementation phase.
And Priti Patel, in her time as Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, Robert Jenrick on immigration, they constantly said they were running into obstacles within the Home Office. That may or may not be true. It may be a foil, maybe an excuse, but they said it. And that brings us neatly on to another story today, Olivia. Labour's asylum plan. Allegedly, they have now clarified that the Illegal Migration Act, which at present passed in July last year, effectively bars anyone who comes to the UK illegally from claiming asylum, will be overturned if the Labour Party get into power. That could be as many as an extra 115,000 arriving illegally by dinghy allowed to claim asylum.
I think one of the most obvious and very quick changes to Britain that we will see if we do get a Labour government is changes to the immigration system. This announcement that illegal migrants could now claim, small boat migrants that is, could now claim asylum under asylum laws under a Labour government is very, very different. Really a lot of clear blue water between Labour and the Conservatives on that. And it's not the only place where Labour and the Conservatives now are completely at odds on immigration. The Labour Party has said that even if the Rwanda scheme is up and running, working really well by the time Labour gets into power, they would dismantle it completely. What effect will that have on the number of migrants coming over here? Labour's plan to tackle it is to employ 1,000 new caseworkers. Well, Conservative MPs I've spoken to say that more pen pushers is the absolute last thing we need. But perhaps with a more operational Home Office, with dare I say, a Home Office which is more conducive to the government, it might be that actually immigration falls under Labour. We'll have to wait and see.
And all those extra pen pushers, of course, if their job is to simply sign people into the country because they're allowed to apply for asylum, Olivia, begs the question, that's not much of a deterrent. That's more of a kind of, is that rolling out the red carpet?
Well, it'll be really interesting to see how it all comes into play. You could argue that at the moment there are all sorts of theoretical deterrents to migrants coming over here. You can be pushed onto a barge in the middle of nowhere. You won't be able to stay in your cushy hotel for a while. You might even be deported to Rwanda. And yet, day after day, there are more and more migrants coming over here. In fact, in the last week, there was a record number of migrants coming over here. So Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer would argue the Tory way hasn't worked. It's time to try something new.
Fair point, Olivia Utley. Always a pleasure, never a chore. Thanks for joining me in the studio.